Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Today in the Middle East, with more than 700 television channels, hundreds of thousands of bloggers, and nearly 40 million Facebook users, it would be impossible to impose a total blackout in the news in the Arab world, no matter how some governments may try. But how can we, in this communication jungle, ensure fair and accurate reporting, especially on television, which is still by far the most important opinion former in the region? How can we ensure fair reporting, and especially during this complex jungle of events in our Arab Spring? To answer this question and many more relating to the role of the media in the Arab Spring, we have the honor of holding this discussion. My name is Talal al Hajj, and I am from al-Arabiya News Channel, Bureau Chief in New York, and I feel honored and privileged to be your moderator today, especially in the presence of our distinguished panel members. Let me start by introducing our panelists. We are indeed honored to have with us today Mr. Faisal J. Abbas, Editor-in-Chief of al-Arabiya Net English. Please make your way and have a seat, please. We also have Vice President and Director of News in the Associated Press, Mr. Sandy McIntyre. Last but not least, we do have with us Mr. Ben DePere, the newly appointed editor in Channel 4 News. Welcome. But before I start the discussion, I would like, if I may, recognize a very distinguished member of our audience, the High Commissioner of the United Nations on Refugees and special representative of SG Ban Ki-moon to this very important gathering in News Exchange, Mr. Antonio Guterres. Please give a hand. If somebody can pass him the microphone, please, I'd like to ask him a question. He just came back from the Middle East last night very late, and he was a keynote speaker here in this gathering today. And I'd like to ask him a question concerning the status of refugees in the Middle East, especially, we can't find a microphone, okay. Especially with regard to the status of refugees, and whether he feels that the Arab world and the world media is shedding enough light on the plight of refugee problems emanating from the Arab Spring, of course. And the case in mind here is Syria, of course, where we have about 400,000 refugees, registered ones only, in neighboring countries, and more than 2.5 million internally displaced people, IDP, within Syria. So you just came from the area. If you would like to share your thoughts with us, we'd be very honored. Thank you very much, sir.
I believe that if there is a series of extremely important events in the world where journalists can be very proud about the role they've played, is the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening. Not only in relation to the Arab Spring in itself, the way it was reported, but I would say the way journalists were involved in it. Many people speak about the role of Facebook and Twitter and in the revolutions, but the truth is that traditional media, and especially television networks, played a very, very important role in what has happened. So we are doing a good job. So we need to recognize that, first of all. And second, in relation to the tragic events that also occur, let's not forget the very positive developments in many of the Arab countries, but if you also look at the tragic events that are occurring, namely in Syria today, I would say that if someone is really doing their job, is the media. The media has done a fantastic job reporting what's happening. It opened news everywhere, every day. Nobody can say that they are not aware of the dramatic political impasse and of the tragic humanitarian consequences. What we need, in my opinion, is an international community that is able to act with the same efficiency as the media was able to report what's going on the ground.
Mr. Guterres, thank you so much, sir. It's an honor to have you around, and we know you have a plane to catch, so we'll let you on your way. Thank you, sir. I'd like to start this conversation by really posing a question to our audience here, which is mainly composed of media professionals. There's a question now, you'll see it on the screen, I hope, which says, have you ever been in a situation where you unwittingly, without knowing, promoted one-sided views or ideas belonging to one side or another, particularly in the case of Syria and the Syrian conflict? If you have done so, please say yes, and if you haven't, please press no. You can use your... and 30% said yes, and about 69.6% said no. Thank you, audience. I'd like to ask, did any of you say yes, panels? No. All right. Any of the audience who said yes, can I have a hand up? From the 30%, is anybody brave enough to put a hand up? Oh, there, okay. Can you tell us your story? How did you promote unwittingly some propaganda for one side or another? Can you tell us the story quickly?
Oh, of course, I wouldn't say that was a propaganda. I made it absolutely unintendedly, but sometimes while I am discussing this conflict and while I'm writing about it, I feel that somehow I may be influenced by another media or more than one media, for example. So I wouldn't call it propaganda anyway, but I believe that all of us are somehow influenced by different media, and even from Syrian activists, because Syrian activists are also sometimes one-sided viewing the events. And I believe that we must first consider this fact that we can be influenced, and after this we can be more objectively reporting and writing about the issue. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you just give us your name and your affiliation?
I am Nevena Borisova from Bulgaria.
Thank you so much. I'd like to pose some questions to you guys. The Arab Spring, the name was given by the media to the earth-shaking events in the Middle East, and later was followed by politicians. Do you think so-called Arab Spring is still a spring, or did we enter winter now? Any of you, please?
Well, people seem to forget that, as they say, the night is always darkest before the dawn. These regimes, most of these regimes have been there for decades. The change has to take its normal path, and let us not forget how, in other democracies such as France, how long it took to get to where there is today. So there's certainly a lot of reasons for people to be pessimistic, but let us not forget there's also a lot of reasons for people to be optimistic. Ben?
I think as journalists and as media companies, we're obsessed with events rather than processes. The event of the Arab Spring was an incredible event, and it was widely covered at the time for months. And really, now there's a process of maybe democratization or of change going on in the Arab world. It's not something we cover as in depth as we did the events. Of course, if there's an event like Benghazi, or if there's violence on the streets of Cairo, or if there are huge newsworthy events, then they are covered. But you kind of miss the process in the meantime.
Sandy?
I think it's become a cheap tagline, to be honest, whether it's an Arab Spring or an Arab winter. What we're clearly seeing is a path to a new future. Now, is that future Western-style democracy? Should that future even be Western-style democracy? I don't think any Western journalist is in a position to make a value judgment on that. And I would echo what the guys say here. I mean, this is something that's going to play out, in which we have a responsibility to be viewers of, analysts of, but certainly beyond commentary. We shouldn't be putting cheap taglines on it anymore.
I tend to agree with you, sir. I would like here now to introduce to you a video, actually two videos. One, and they are both in the Daraya massacre in Syria that left hundreds of people dead or injured. The first video was aired by the Syrian government television station and shows a reporter conducting a television interview with a girl standing near her dead mother's body. And another clip showing the same reporter interviewing a dying woman. Let's see the first video together, please.
الضحايا في كل مكان. لا أدري إذا كانت ستسعفني الكلمات في أن أعبر عن ما أرى. هنا امرأة لا تزال على قيد الحياة. سوف نتكلم معها ونسمع وتسمعون ماذا حدث معها.
ما بعرف، رايحة بدي أروح على الشام أنا وجوزي وولادي. فجأة لقيت حالي هيك مضروبة.
مين ضربك خالي؟ احكي لنا.
والله ما عرفت، ما بعرف وين أولادي.
إذا هنا استشهدت الأم وما زال الأطفال أحياء. لكل شهداء سوريا. مين هي اللي حدك؟ وين كنتوا رايحين؟ تعرفي شو صار معي؟
You've seen that, and now let's see the opposition group's video, which was broadcast on YouTube, and so many stations picked it up. Can we see that, please?
مقابر جماعي 26/8/2012 المقبرة الخامسة المقابر الجماعية في دارنا أكثر من 300 جثة. مقابر الجماعية للأطفال والنساء. الله يلتقي.
As I said earlier, this is from YouTube, and I stress that it was posted like many activist videos we see on YouTube. Now, my question to the panel really is, you've seen how the story was told by the opposing factions in this conflict. How did you report in the Daraya massacre? I'll start with you, Ben, especially in the light that you don't have people on the ground most cases, and how can you tell which side is telling the truth?
We've been reporting this for 18 months, like other people. We have developed a system whereby we have a number of translators who come in, who look through the footage that is available, and this may make it sound like almost an industrial process, but we go on the volume of pictures, the volume of reports, and we rely on all the different agencies that are reporting, as well as activist video on the ground. What we try and do is collate the best information we can. We look at maps. We use Reuters, AP. We also use Storyful, who are an organization who verify pictures with, they'll verify a shot of a street and a building, and they will look for other pictures from that area and try and identify whether that is the area claimed from satellite images and other images. And we also, Storyful are also able to find people on the ground who they trust as sources. We have a number of translators who we rely on, and Syrians who come in and help us. But it's a very, very difficult process, and we find we spend far more time verifying the pictures than we do perhaps writing to them.
I suppose, Sandy, you follow the same procedures?
Pretty similar. I mean, we don't outsource accuracy, so we try and deal with user-generated content in-house, and we've got a team who does that. I think this was a classic example of where your starting point has to be that you're not going to know the full story based on any amount of picture coming into you when you didn't have your own boots on the ground. So you have to bring a healthy dose of kind of cynicism to everything. And you have to recognise that you need to share that with the audience straight away, that what you're going to show them on that particular day is only what you know to that point. You then have to try and continue reporting out that story over the weeks and months, and obviously one of the very tough things to do in Syria is to report, at least consistently, from the government side. And that has actually been, in many ways, the first casualty of this war.
Not to add anything, Faisal?
Well, perhaps the only thing I can add to what Ben was saying is that at Al-Arabiya we have the advantage of having native speakers, so we don't really need to get the translators. But what we've done in this incident is we posted both videos, both sides of the stories, after our attempts to verification, and we said Al-Arabiya couldn't independently verify this particular incident, and as far as I know, it's been requested by the United Nations to investigate what actually happened on that day.
I'd like to throw this question to the audience. If anybody would like to comment on this particular topic, yes, please. Can somebody give a microphone, please? Microphone, same microphone. If you can state your name and your affiliation, please, first.
Yes, my name is Elizabeth Filippouli, and I represent Global Thinkers. We are an organization that promotes positive change. My question is, and I actually just sent a tweet about it, who invented the term Arab Spring? I believe that this must have been invented or given by a Western source. How is it viewed and why is it replicated by Arab media?
Okay. I think we dealt with this question actually in the beginning, and Sanji and Ben and Faisal gave an adequate answer. Do you want to add anything to what you said earlier?
I don't know who invented it, but it's past its sell-by date.
It's past its sell-by date. All right. Okay, let's move on. I'd like here now to throw a question to the audience again and ask you to vote on it, please. The media has been accused of taking sides of the people's revolutions during the Arab Spring rather than the regimes. So I would like to, at this juncture, to pose a question to you and ask you, is supporting human rights and legitimate people's aspiration for freedom and democracy more important than observing professional practices and standards of journalism? If it's more important and you say yes, please press yes, and if it's not, say no, please. All right, 37% say yes. It's more important to support human rights and legitimate people's aspirations than to follow your traditional standards of journalism. And 63%, and I'm one of the 63%, says no. So I would like to have the panels. Sandy, let me start with you.
I think you have to almost say this is not a yes-no question.
Okay.
In as much as being able to freely conduct journalism is actually in support of human rights, because one of the basic human rights is the right of expression. So to be able to do your work unhindered and to gain access as a neutral observer, to me, is the most important thing.
But you would follow it, applying your known standards and professional standards that you followed all your life.
Look, your standards can't change regardless of the continent or the conflict. You have standards. Generally speaking, certainly in the case of AP, and I'm sure in the case of every other news organisation here, those are standards which they not only uphold, but they publish, they're happy to stand up to, and therefore, because your standards don't alter, you go into every conflict saying, we look to gain access to both sides, we look to neutrally and independently report on this, and actually it's for audiences as well to decide. It is not just our decision to make.
Ben?
I don't think the standards change, but the practices have changed so massively since the beginning of the Arab Spring, or perhaps since the Iranian election three years ago. And that is that you can now go on to YouTube or Google and type in Syria human rights abuses, and you'll probably get a choice of over 150,000 different video clips. It means that you can tell the story, the picture is there, but you have to collate the story, which brings about another set of values, which is what do you believe. Organizations don't have to go to Syria now to get the pictures they need, which you may have had to do during Bosnia or wars before. And the pictures are all there. It just depends how you want to use them. And I think the temptation not to go and cover the story and to use those pictures that exist from activists and people on the ground could lead to a lowering of standards.
Faisal?
No, I agree perfectly. Just by doing your job as a journalist professionally, that is the biggest support you can give to any human rights activist or people's aspiration for freedom. However, just to dwell a bit on the social media issue you've raised, I think the line that distinguishes between a journalist and an activist is continuously becoming a bit more blurred. Journalists are not activists, they shouldn't be, and the most effective way for you to get a message across is have a professional journalist get both sides of a story.
I'd like a brave member of the audience who said yes, please, to raise his hand and tell us why he or she said yes. Any brave soul? Yes, please. Introduce yourself, please, your name and affiliation.
Yeah. My name is Lemi Olalemi from TVC News, Nigeria. I believe we need to respect people's aspirations and freedom, but within a law. And that is where journalism practices come in. You encourage people to be on the street to send away the regimes. What comes after? Chaos. How do you bring the control? Without practices, journalism practices, and aspirations.
Thank you for your opinion. Many journalists were victims of kidnapping, harassment, or even death. Have you ever, in your line of job, have you ever been obliged to censor any information or footage, or even not to broadcast the story, just in order to protect your correspondent on the ground? And how did you deal with such incidents?
Look, obviously for every news organisation, safety is paramount. We know that. How we've dealt with it in Syria in particular is, I wouldn't say any form of censorship, but what we have actually done is to put some quite hard and fast rules around from where and when we will transmit. So we're not going to transmit from the place that the story was filmed, not just for our protection, but for the protection of the people who live there. We are going to keep communication down to the bare minimum. I think it's an open secret that there may very well be a fairly sophisticated way of tapping into communications. So we're taking what we would describe as all reasonable steps in a really, really volatile and dangerous situation to ensure that the people who we've put in harm's way for the mission that we conduct in journalism can do it in a way that they can tell the story, but to an extent minimize the risk to themselves and the people who they're reporting on.
Anybody like to add?
Sure. We always say this in the newsroom. The time you realize that you're actually doing your job right is when you get criticism from both parties. So not only do we have, for example, the Syrian regime accusing us for being anti-regime, but very few people realize that Al-Arabiya has lost more than any other Arab outlet journalists on the ground, and it's a real pity, and these were very brave journalists. But most recently, we had to withdraw one of our correspondents who was embedded with the opposition because we wouldn't agree to cover it the way they do. For them, we were not pro-opposition enough. So yes, I agree perfectly. The safety of our journalists, of our human capital is paramount, and that is above and beyond anything else.
Okay, I'd like to ask the audience to comment on this issue. If anybody would like to comment on the issue, please raise your hand. Okay, everybody believes you guys. What margin of freedom does a correspondent have when covering a story like the war in Syria? If he was embedded with the Syrian Free Army or with the government army, embedding journalists is now the standard way of reporting conflicts, but I would argue that what makes a good story might not be the right story, but I'd like to have your thoughts on the subject, please.
May I just say something very quickly? The term, what they say is embedded is embedded. So, it comes, it's not a tactic that doesn't come without its issues.
Please.
I don't think there's such a term that's relevant in terms of embed with in this conflict in Syria. I think what you are accepting is that if you're reporting on opposition fighters, that you are trying to move independently, but in many cases you're moving with them. Now, is that embedding? I don't think so. You've got your own vehicle, you've clearly got your own decisions on where you're going to go and where you're not going to go, and that's certainly the route that we've taken. I don't see any great advantage in pushing towards some sort of, embed situation, partly because the people who you would be embedding with are not giving you any protection that you wouldn't gain from being on the road yourself and picking up the local knowledge and working with people who know that,
but you still
who know
need
that
the
region.
help. You still need the help.
Look, you need the help of every protagonist in every conflict to cover it. And we'd be deluding ourselves to think that you can go there and not engage.
But
you
they
want
have to
to
like
engage.
you to give you. They have to like you to give you help, to a certain extent.
They certainly have. We've had many occasions where they've liked us. We've had many occasions where they've been very critical of us, and we've always been able to go to a situation that we've talked that through, and we've been able to proceed. But part of that, I think, is the reputation that you build up, not just in that conflict, but the reputation your organisation builds up over the generations of reporting conflict.
Thank you. Would you like to say something?
We've been, I think our cars we've been travelling have been attacked by both sides in Syria, and we have tried to move away from doing the conflict from either side. We've moved to our last, I think I'm correct in saying, our last 5 pieces from Syria have been observational. We've sent in a filmmaker who, on his own, he knows Syria very well. He's a fluent Arabic speaker, and he's gone and lived in a village or a town for a period of time, 2 or 3 weeks, and he has gathered fly-on-the-wall documentary observational style material, which we've turned into films. We haven't sought to get any of the fighting, but we've sought to see the conflict from both sides. You find in towns that they're starting to hate the FSA as much as they hate the Assad government, and it's really that story that we're trying to tell now, rather than the fighting story.
Thank you. I'd like to ask another question to the audience. Do Western journalists think that some Arab media outlets exaggerate in its Arab Spring coverage? It's not going to be a voting question, but I'd like to hear some response from some of the people here. We're all professionals, and I'm sure you have your opinions on the subject. Do you think Arab media exaggerate in their coverage of Arab Spring, and some Arab journalists? Do you think that some Western medias are superficial in their coverage? They don't dig deep in the story. Anybody would like to give me an answer? If you don't, raise your hands. I'll choose one of you. Please.
Yvonne from Al Jazeera.
Your name? Sorry.
My name is Yvonne.
And you are from?
Al Jazeera.
Okay.
There's a lot of, more like a comment and a contrast. I think there's a lot of pressure to keep a drama going and to keep a story going without events actually happening, especially in...
Why do you call it a drama when there are hundreds of people dying every day? It is a very tragic story.
Well, I'm not sure of the numbers of the people who are actually dying every day, but what I have noticed is that a lot of the media organizations want to cover the Syria crisis every day, whether there are events happening that they can get to or not. And I think a lot of the media organizations are under pressure to keep the narrative going, even on slow news days, so to speak.
Thank you. Anybody else would give me a different view? Any takers? Yeah. Going. Mr. Nakhla from al-Arabiya, please give me your opinion. I can pick on our own people. It's okay.
Okay. Well, as you said, we see that dozens of people getting killed every day in Syria and sometimes in other places, and this is a real drama. And I'm afraid that editors and producers started to judge this number of killed every day as a normal news, not really a big story. The problem is how to be creative in covering the story all the time. It is the same picture. This is our dilemma. We're getting the same pictures all the time, probably from the same sources all the time. We are finding it extremely difficult to go and investigate the matters ourselves. We are finding it extremely difficult to personalize the stories. It is because our correspondents are not free to go inside many different places, verify the stories, live with people, give us in depth the insight of the stories itself. I agree that there is lots of repetition in covering the Arab Spring, but it is an ongoing story, and it is the biggest story, and there is no other story bigger than it at the time being.
Thank you, Mr. Nakhl. Mr. Talal al Hajj is our the Arabiya head of news, of course. He didn't introduce himself. Anybody else here who think the Western media was superficial in their coverage? Any Arab journalists? Okay, we all agree that you've done a good job, guys.
I think to be fair, we could continue to do a better job. I mean, I think that, some of the films that Ben and his team have been making at Channel 4 are really refreshing. I think we need to get to the next level now to tell this story. I mean, we spent more than 24 hours in one hospital near Aleppo. We were able to tell it through the eyes of one doctor, and shockingly, his 8-year-old son was in the hospital with him because he had nowhere else to go. And in 24 hours of just covering that, and Khalid Kazea did a great job for us doing that, you got a greater insight into what was going on, frankly, than combing through endless amounts of UGC material, or indeed even some of the other stuff that we'd been able to do ourselves. So I think we've got to step up the game a bit here. We've got to recognise that it's an incredibly difficult story to tell, and that we've got to use every single tool in the journalist's toolkit to tell it, and we've got to see it as a jigsaw, and it's a story you need to try and tell as best you can in the country, but you also need to piece together the other pieces. And if the Western media, and I would to an extent include our own organisation in this, could be criticised for anything in recent weeks, is I don't think we jumped on the whole Qatari involvement in it soon enough. I don't think we necessarily explained to people what that was about and what the ramifications should be of this. And I think the whole kind of geopolitical and geoeconomic moving parts in this, we could do a better job around.
Thank you, Sandy. Faisal, we have to move. Sure. To move on to the next question, if I may. Sure. If I may. It seems that most media outlets gave the Syrian opposition a preference or upper hand in coverage. That's the perception of the viewers. In terms of interviews, allowing them more time to tell their own side of the story, what is the reason for this obvious imbalance? Please, Ben.
I think it's a more attractive story to tell. The people who rise up in a country where there hasn't been a political process or democracy for years, that is the story you're interested in. I think in the past month or two, that's become a much less attractive story when you realize there's no one coherent voice, and also that it's quite obvious now from the pictures and the evidence that's come out that they have been guilty of very grievous human rights abuses or alleged abuses as the people who were oppressing them to start with.
I think it also doesn't help when the Syrian government is not willing to talk to you and consider you part of the conflict.
I think that's right. I think you can sum that up in one word, which says access.
Access.
Or lack of it. But I think Ben's right. I don't think we can just hide behind the shield that says, oh, we only got access to one side, so we only told one side.
Faisal?
No, absolutely. People tend to forget that you're not dealing with the Swiss regime. You're dealing with Syria, which is one of the most secretive regimes on the face of the planet. Now, there's been incidents where we've constantly invited members of the Syrian government to appear on our screen, and they continuously decline. They decline to give access to people to go on the ground unless they report the way they see fit, which by default makes some people think that we are preferring the point of view of the opposition. But just if you allow me a few seconds on that point in particular, it is not true that the sudden criticism of the Syrian regime came now. Our archive is our track record. We've always been critical when necessary, and that's part of our job as journalists, of the Syrian regime, of the Iranian regime, of the Libyan regime. It is not something that has been invented yesterday or in 2011. It's part of what we do, again, when necessary, and doing it in an objective, independent, and unbiased way.
I'd like to ask you about the ethnic dimension. The Syrian crisis has been mostly avoided in the media, and sometimes even excluded completely. Can you explain the reason for that? The ethnic. Ben, would you like?
We have tried, through the use of maps, through the use of interviews, to describe the ethnic mix in Syria, which is an extraordinary mix because it's not perhaps like Bosnia, where there was a town which was also very mixed, but you could delineate and draw a map. We found it almost impossible to draw maps in order to explain where, because people live side by side. Obviously, there are districts that are more Sunni than Shia, and ones that are Christian. But it's something we have struggled with because it is a very complicated conflict, and once you start, I think in Bosnia the media was guilty of this, that the Serbs were just the bad guys and everyone else were the good guys. And it's something we try and address, but I can't say we get perfectly right.
We all know that the body that determines whether a conflict is a civil war or not is not the United Nations, but the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross. Now, the ICRC called the conflict in Syria on the 15th of July this year a civil war. Western media outlets started calling it as such, a civil war. In your opinion, is this a suitable description of the conflict in Syria? Is it a civil war, especially that we have a regular army run by a government dictatorship, if I may call it, and people who demonstrated peacefully, and it started peacefully, everybody agrees on that, and then they were forced to pick up arms to protect themselves. So we have an army, a regular army, we have people protecting themselves, or trying to protect themselves. Is it the right description? Is it a civil war?
It's a civil war as far as we're concerned now, in terms of the way we report it, in terms of what we write. And I think for us the tipping point was not only the ICRC statement, but also the move from being, and this is true of any conflict, I mean, when does the AP characterize something as a civil war? The answer broadly is when it moves from a government and an opposition group, unarmed or loosely armed, to two groups who are seriously armed within the same country. And that Rubicon was crossed. I think the ICRC's ratification of that term helped us, and we moved to the term civil war the day after.
I would like to pick some of the audience if they have. May I choose some of you guys? You, gentlemen. Yes, you. Big smile. That's you. Yes. Can you stand up, please? What's your name and what affiliation? Wait for the...
My name is Alexis Angulo. I'm a freelancer. I'm from Mexico.
Okay. Do you consider the war in Syria a civil war? Do you consider the war in Syria, the conflict in Syria, a civil war?
Well, I get yes.
Why?
Because there's been conflicts. I think that in general the perception we have of what's happening in Middle East and in general, it's all about civil wars. And
okay.
Yeah, but I really don't have an opinion about it.
All right, I'd like to rephrase my question. We have a conflict in Libya. We had a conflict in Libya and still continuing. I mean, the news of Beni Walid is still fresh in everybody's mind. And that conflict in Libya, there was a war between two factions of the government and the people, people and people. Why nobody called it a civil war? Can anybody from the audience, if I may, just please? The man with the white hair, the smiley face. Stand up, please, and present. Your name is?
Nigel Parsons, CEO of TVC Nigeria. I was actually in Libya, working in Libya at the time NATO decided to remove Colonel Gaddafi as a government. But yeah, it was a civil war. I mean, anyone who was living there knew that this is a country of factions, of tribes. It was only held together by a particularly strong dictator who had probably overstayed his welcome. I mean, 41 years is an awful long time. Not going to apologize to him, but you forget that in Libya, when he came to power, there was homelessness, no national health, and a lot of illiteracy. The time he left, actually, there was none of that. But he certainly overstayed his welcome. But the thing is that Libya is a tribal country, and as soon as you took off that lid, it was going to go into civil war. It was a civil war. So what? It was the army against...
It wasn't called a civil war by the ICRC. That's my argument.
Yeah, but that's the ICRC's problem. Anyone can see it was a civil war. Oh. and I think the journalists actually should not just listen to the ICRC and what categorized a civil war. It was a civil war. It still is a civil war.
Yeah, but it sets the standard. But thank you very much. I appreciate your... I'm afraid we, ladies and gentlemen, time caught up with us again. And on behalf of Al-Arabiya, my producer, Mr. Paulus Haddad, who's shouting in my ear, and myself, I want to thank our distinguished panel, who are honored today, honored us by their presence. Mr. Faisal J. Abbas, the Editor-in-Chief of Al-Arabiya English, Mr. Sandy McIntyre, Vice President and Director of News at Associated Press, and last but not least, Mr. Ben DeBeer, the newly appointed editor in Channel 4 News. Thank you so much, gentlemen. You honored us with your presence. And I thank you, our dear audience. You certainly made it interesting, and give yourself a round of applause, please. Thank you. Gotta go. Thank you, guy. Thank you.